Hey, welcome back to BarryTsGarage, and today we have the joy of having another session with Steve. We'll call it Ask Steve. We've done one of these before. And Steve Coppock, good to see you again.
Hey, welcome back, Barry. It's always good to see you, of course.
We always have fun.
Yeah, we do.
And you have brought us through just flathead history and details. You've shown us superchargers for flatheads. You've shown us ARDUN head overhead valve conversions. And then we did a dyno with a supercharger on everything. And as a result, we have questions. People have brought about different questions about flatheads. And so I think it'd be fun to get some of these answered.
Yeah, I'm happy to give it a try. I always paraphrase, from our last session. I'll do the very best I can. And I certainly don't know everything. And if I don't, I'll say.
Yeah.
And I'll certainly don't mind doing a lookup and providing information through you. And
okay,
if we can't answer a question.
Now, just to refresh people who don't know or may not have had a chance to catch it, when did you start messing with Ford flatheads?
Oh goodness, when I was about 15 years old.
Okay.
I got my first car and engine, which was a flathead. Actually, there was three, I think, that my dad and I scoured up and put one together.
Okay.
And I still have that engine. I still have that car.
Awesome.
50 years later.
Wow. Okay, so that gives you some authority right there. You've been messing that long.
Yeah.
Now, okay, next question. About how many flathead engine blocks do you have in your possession at the moment? Just approximate.
Just slightly less than 100.
Okay. Does that include this room?
Yes.
Okay, just making sure.
Yeah, and nobody, including me, needs that many, and I may be reducing them significantly. But I don't. Some of these, I bought one at a time. I find some advertisement somewhere and jumping in the truck and going and find them, and others, found me, I guess you might say, or somebody, just was getting older and decided they wanted to sell their collection, or in one case, a person actually did pass away and was able to buy some of the parts from that estate.
Yeah.
But I got too many, but I got things pretty well sorted out, and if I do decide to sell some stuff, at least I'll know what I have, and somebody else might know what I have. But I've had a lot of them, and I do enjoy them. I don't see me stopping messing with flatheads probably ever, but I don't need 100.
No.
Or about 100.
Right. Okay. Well, that's another notch in the authority you have.
Oh, okay. Well,
okay, that's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
And then you have all these supercharger parts for flatheads, and that's another whole thing that keeps you on it.
So yes, and I really, really do enjoy the supercharging of the flatheads. They're great engines, and we've proven they're very robust. A lot of people might disagree with me on that, but we've made that motor made 300 horsepower, and the ARDUN made 416, and they don't breathe very well, and so a little help on the intake side just wakes them right up. And they're so much fun to drive, and of course I believe the flatheads look really nice too, and the supercharger just adds to that look. So
that's fun.
But all this stuff on this end of the shop is all supercharger parts.
Yeah, you've got a lot.
A lot of them, yeah.
That's good. All right, well, let's get some of these questions answered. People want to know things.
I'll do my best.
All right. And this is in no particular order, kind of the order they've come in, I think. So Johnny is asking, can you ask Steve what kind of lift and duration do you have on the camshaft? And that was on the first dyno we did with the overhead. It was on the ARDUN.
On the ARDUN, okay.
It was on the ARDUN, so yeah.
Yeah, the ARDUN has a cam made by a company called Bullet Racing Cams.
Okay.
And it's 232 degrees duration at 50 thousandths, both on the intake and exhaust. And the lobe lift is 350 thousandths, 0.350 on the intake and the exhaust. Interestingly, on the ARDUN, of course, it does have rocker arms. On a flathead, the cam lift is also the valve lift,
right?
Minus the gap, where you set the valve and lifter clearance.
Sure.
But on ARDUN, there's rocker arms, and there's two different length rocker arms intake. I think the intakes are 1.37-ish, and exhaust about 1.2 ratio. So you multiply that 0.350 times the ratio and get the lift at the cam, which turns out to be about 450 thousandths and 420 thousandths. I think that's about what they end up being.
Okay.
So not a super, aggressive cam, just a nice, and it is a flat tappet cam, not a roller cam or anything like that.
Mm-hmm.
Pretty standard kind of stuff.
And yet, we may as well touch on this now because the lash adjustment.
Yeah.
Yeah, so tell me about how the lash works on a normal flathead and compare it to what you deal with the ARDUN.
Well, and other people this may not be news to some people, but it's news to me. And I've been working on engines, not just flatheads, for a long, long time. And typically, you set the lash, that was a word I was struggling with earlier, at some measurement. And usually the cam manufacturer is the one that sets that. And that's generally speaking, so when you set it cold, and then as the engine heats up, the parts expand, and then that lash reduces, and you want it to reduce, but you don't want it to get reduced so much that it holds the valve open when you heat up. So usually it's in, I'm making this up a little bit, but 12 to 15, 16 thousandths, some all the way up to 18 thousandths of an inch that I've seen. But on the ARDUN, one of the things I learned there was the cam manufacturer specifies 10 thousandths on the intake and 12 thousandths on the exhaust, which is pretty tight in my experience. And so I got to asking a bunch of questions about that. And what I found out is that the ARDUN, it's an aluminum head and it's about that thick.
Yeah.
And that as the engine heats up, the head expands and the push rods don't expand as much. And so the lash actually increases as the engine gets warmer. So that was a learning for me. So yeah, when I set the ARDUN up, 10 thousandths on the intake, 12 on the exhaust, and that is where it likes to be.
So would it literally get a little bit more of a lash as it gets hotter?
Yes, and I checked that. Ran you did a video of us starting the engine at my house, and after that I ran it some more and got it pretty warm. On purpose because I wanted to retorque the head bolts and check the lash. And sure enough, when I'd shut the engine down, I pulled the valve covers off and checked the lash right away because I wanted to see. And sure enough, they were slightly looser, only by a couple thousandths, but then when they were cold. So
isn't that interesting? That
is something I learned.
Yeah.
I would have never figured that out on my own.
Hey, I'd never heard of it.
Yeah.
So that's cool.
Yeah.
Frugal Off Grid says, I'm building my first engine. It's a 77 250 inline 6. Okay, this is not probably a flathead question, but he has new head bolts on it. Do I need thread lock or something else? And we're asking you because you have bolted a lot of head bolts on over the years. What do you think about it?
So generally speaking, the bolts are lubricated with something, and the something kind of depends. And on an old 6-cylinder engine, my best guess is that engine oil is probably what would be used. There's probably some good engine forums for that particular engine to reach out to. That maybe there's some specifics that I'm not aware of, but the modern engines are generally speaking put together dry. They don't have any thread lubricant. ARP, which is they make a lot of bolts. They sell their own lubricant. I got some right over here. It's a graphite-based lubricant. But yeah, it's important to know because we'll maybe get a little bit into a little bit of theory here. But when you put torque on a bolt, let's just make this up, that the threads are locked. The threads of the bolt are locked in the block.
Yeah.
You put 50 foot-pounds on it, you haven't tightened the bolt at all because there's, it's locked, for some maybe rust or something else. So the lubricant is really important. So as you're tightening or torquing the head bolt, you get the right stretch for the torque that you're applying. So it's a great question.
Okay.
And I'm only guessing it's oil, but it's probably some folks.
And I may have read the question wrong because I was just rereading it.
Okay.
And this really goes the other direction.
Yeah.
He's asking about putting a thread locker.
No, I should not have to do that at all. What you're doing when you torque a bolt is you're stretching it. And the stretch should be there to take care of any, like you're talking earlier about valve lash as the cylinder head and the block move around a little bit in the head gasket. The bolt will stretch with it if it's tightened properly.
Okay.
And so there's really no need to add any additional thread locker or lock nuts or anything on on a fastener. Was that a head bolt?
Head bolts.
Yeah, should not need to do anything like that.
We're back to the ARDUN.
Okay.
What are the valve sizes on the ARDUN heads?
Intake valves, if I recall, are 1.8875 inches.
Okay.
And the exhaust valves are 1.5 inches. And I believe those are, at least for the reproduction heads, like I have on the engine behind you there, are actually Chevrolet spec valves. And I believe the exhaust, the 1.5-inch exhaust, we talked about that being a flathead kind of a valve. I think it's the same basic Chevy valve, and the 1.8875 I think is a big block Chevy intake valve, I think.
Do you need to increase oil capacity? Like, you're changing the oil circuit on that machine.
So my answer is yes, but I will say there's plenty of them that have been built that keep the stock oil pan and seem to work just fine. But to the point, I think, is since you're adding all of that extra oil up on top of the engine, it will stay up on the top of the engine. It drains back through a 3/8-inch tube on each side of the motor.
Mm-hmm.
But you pump quite a bit more than the capacity of that oil line up into the top of the motor. When it's at, when it's like on the dynamometer and we're running clear up to 6,000 RPM, there'll be oil in those valve covers that doesn't get up back in the oil pan right away.
Yeah.
Driving down the highway, my guess is probably works just fine
Mm-hmm.
with the stock oil pan. But the one on the engine behind you is 8 quarts.
Okay.
And stock is 4.5 to 5, something like that.
Okay.
So the extra capacity is there because oil does accumulate in the top.
Okay. All right. Good question.
It is a good question.
All right. Next question is from DeSolo. It says, I currently have a 32-21 stud. Have you had any concerns on a 21 stud on the rear seal?
Well, of course, they don't have a seal in the back on the 21 studs. They're a slinger.
Which would maybe why he says conversion kit.
Yeah, conversion kit.
Okay.
I don't have any experience with the conversion kits, so
Okay.
I probably don't have any useful information for him.
Okay.
Certainly offline, if he wants to reach out to me, and maybe we can talk a little bit about that offline, and
Yeah.
I can learn a little bit and weigh in to the extent I can.
Okay. Okay, cool. B-Dub says, has anyone put these heads on a flow bench? Be interesting to see. It was a great video. Thank you.
Oh, yes. I flow tested the ARDUN heads. I didn't do it myself, but I had it done here in Phoenix, Arizona. And the reason I did it is, and I'm sure someone has done that before, but I reached out and I couldn't find anyone that had the data
Okay.
or that had done it. So it took me a while here in Phoenix to find somebody that had a flow bench and was willing to take it on, because you have to make some adapters and things to adapt that head to the flow bench, which this person did. So yes, I flow tested and I have the data for the ARDUN heads, and I'm happy to share it with anybody that might want to see it.
It's probably a fair bit of it, huh? Fair bit of data.
Well, it's I don't know. Usually do the flow testing at discrete valve lifts, so maybe there's 5 or 6 data points on the intake and exhaust. And I only did one port. Maybe that someone might think I should have tested both heads and all 16 ports, but
That'd be a lot. Yeah.
I did, and but I did it because I wanted to know, and then I use the computer models, which we've talked about, to predict the power, and the flow is so important to making to get an accurate prediction. And as we know, the predictions from the software were essentially right on. So I think the flow testing was good, and I think it was good data. So I'm happy to share that if anybody wants to see it.
Okay. Thank you. I've got another question. I'm going to condense the question a little bit because it's a pretty lengthy question.
Sure.
But Chris is asking, and this is about the ARDUN heads on the dyno.
Yeah.
It'd be interesting to see how the engine would respond with different CFM 4 barrels. And he suggests a few different ones, and how sometimes even at 5,500 RPM, you're only getting so much through there. What are your thoughts? I mean, you could spend days and days on dynos doing different things. What are your thoughts on different carburetors?
He's right. You probably would get slightly different results. Usually at wide open throttle, it's not that critical. And what I mean is if you had a, I don't know, 1,000 CFM Dominator carburetor on there or something, maybe that would, you might see maybe less power because the carburetor is so big. And I don't know if it was this person or someone else, but mentioned that maybe there wasn't enough air velocity through the carburetor to pull the fuel out, and that's why we were seeing the lean condition.
Yeah, that's a
so that could be. I think I explained, but I was running that 750 on the 750 CFM carburetor because I was going to put the supercharger on in the afternoon, and that's the carburetor I picked for the supercharger.
Right.
If I hadn't been putting the supercharger on, I'd probably had a 600 or maybe a 650. But I didn't, So, but here's generally speaking, and I didn't take this data, but if you measure the pressure at the base of the carburetor, like where you would measure vacuum from on the dyno, you want to see about 1 inch of mercury or less at wide open throttle.
Okay.
If you have more than 1 inch of mercury, then the carburetor is the restriction. You're starting to pull a vacuum in the intake manifold.
Okay.
So we didn't take that information, but I think people will be surprised that how much bigger the carburetor really needs to get before you don't have, until you have less than 1 inch of mercury at the base of the carburetor.
Okay.
And so my experience is running a little bit, if you do all the math, 750 is too much carburetor for the non-supercharged ARDUN, and it's probably too much for the supercharged ARDUN.
Yeah.
But if you actually do enough dyno tests and measure that, they always want a bigger carburetor when it comes to power. And I'm not saying this gentleman or person is incorrect. That's just my experience.
Yeah.
They tend to want a bigger carburetor, not a smaller carburetor.
Well, his opinion, just to follow up, he thinks for street use, normal day to day, a 289 might just really want about a 390 CFM carburetor for daily driving. And maybe that's an opinion.
Well, so you run into and he may be right. Certainly there are plenty of 289s running around with a 2-barrel carburetor on them that probably flow less than 390 CFM.
Right.
So it's really what you're designing the motor package to do.
Yeah.
If you're designing a car that primarily spends its time, or a truck for that matter, running around town, running errands that never sees more than about 3,000 RPM, then 390 CFM is probably plenty.
Probably good. Yeah.
If you're building a car to race at a local drag strip or a salt flat racer, you might find that 390 is not near enough for that application.
Yeah.
So it's a great comment, and I don't disagree really with any of it. I just that's the basis of what I picked, why I picked that 750, and I think this one was a 650 when we ran it.
That sounds right. Yeah.
And maybe that was a little on the high side too.
There you go.
So next time we do a dyno test,
Yep.
if you're there, help me remember to check that vacuum signal at the base of the carburetor.
Okay.
We'll see.
Yeah.
We'll see.
Let's get that info.
Yeah.
All right. Well, the next one, Dad Parker says, first of all, he's giving props to you. Said the most surprising thing is the guy who owns it is cool to run it hard. So he got props for that.
Yeah.
And he says, and with cold oil, that engine typically doesn't get over about 140, according to him. And I wonder how the heaters worked back in the day. I don't know if they were too concerned about heating the cab of the car when the ARDUN had it, but I remember when you were talking to Robert, the oil pan was cool still.
Yeah. Yeah, they probably didn't have much of a heater. And of course, you remember the conversion was for trucks.
That's right.
Not for cars, industrial trucks. And not to say that the truck drivers wouldn't want a good heater. But yeah, and when they run cool like that, the heater wouldn't be as good. Of course, if you could get 140 degree temperature out of your heater, that's pretty good too, right?
Yeah,
it's
right.
Not 190, but it's still not too bad.
And again, the oil temperature is different than the coolant temperature.
Yes.
And we're using coolant for the heater.
Yeah. And as we ran the engine, the oil temperature did come up. When you got 8 quarts, like we talked about, it takes a while to circulate 8 quarts, and it takes a while to heat it up. It's just a lot of oil.
Yeah.
And a pretty small engine, actually.
Yeah.
But it eventually heated up a little bit
we use the term in the dyno room when the engine rolled over.
Yeah.
And in context, I learned what that meant, but I didn't know. Robert uses that phrase a lot, it seems.
Yeah.
Could you explain what's going on with the engine when he talks about it rolling over?
Yeah, it's you know, I think you showed some graphs in the video, but if not, or maybe somebody didn't see that video, when you look at primarily when you look at the results from the test, you're looking at horsepower versus revolutions per minute or RPM, and torque, foot-pounds or pound-feet, depending on a person's preference,
Right.
versus RPM or revolutions per minute. You know, when the engine is, you know, at low in the RPM range, you know, idle or just above, there's not much torque and there's not much horsepower. But as you increase the RPM on the dynamometer, the dynamometer is measuring torque. And as we talked in an earlier video, torque is something you measure directly, and then calculating horsepower based off of the torque and the engine speed.
Yeah.
So those two curves, those are really the results of the engine that you built. That's the performance that you're going to get. You get this much torque, and this is what the curve looks like. And this is the horsepower you're getting, and here's what the curve looks like. Again, torque and horsepower versus RPM. So when you talk about rolling over, that's when they quit, the torque and the horsepower stop increasing, and they roll over and start decreasing.
Okay.
And so testing beyond those points is really not beneficial.
Right.
Typical. So that's what we were doing. We're trying to find the point at which the engine started to roll over. And so we were debating on what speed, RPM, to stop the test at, because that's something you have to decide before you start the test.
Right.
And so I think we picked some RPM, I can't remember which one, and to see if those curves were still increasing or not, and we were seeing them still increasing on horsepower. So we decided to run the test a little bit further.
If I remember right,
RPM.
we may have started at 55 and went to 58 or something like that.
Something like that.
Yeah.
And then I
Then
think we ended up
6,000?
at 6,000.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so we're looking at the point at which it tips over or rolls over.
Tips over. That's another phrase.
Yeah.
And is it, I guess, a function a lot, just air, the flow of the air, the breathing from the cam and the valves, like, I guess those are all components of that when it stops making more
Yeah.
power?
And back in our, I don't know, back last year, we did a Flathead performance video, but that information is applicable to any engine, really. But you're really, and this is a term that's used a lot, an engine's really just an air pump.
Yeah.
And how you allow the air and fuel to come in and how you allow it to go out determines sort of the personality of the engine. Because the crank rods and pistons, they really don't care if it's
Right.
a Honda or a Toyota or a Flathead Ford. They're the same basic technology.
Yeah.
So how you deal with the camshaft, compression ratio, what kind of carburetor, what kind of fuel you're running, determines what those curves look like.
Yeah.
And a hot rod motor, typically 5,000, 6,000 RPM peak is where you kind of like it. But if you may not like that engine driving around on the street, where you'd like the torque to be 2,500, 3,000, right? It's just how you design the package, if you will, and put it together. It's what determines that rollover point or that tip over point.
Okay, so Gary was watching our Flathead Ford, Your Destruction for Science, okay? We were looking at those Flathead heads.
Heads.
Yes. And he's wondering, like, you tried quite a few different kinds, and if you want to see that, it's a pretty interesting video. And the story on that's not 100% over yet, I don't think.
Far from.
But anyway, Gary was wanting to know, have you heard about Barron heads for Flathead Fords, and what are your thoughts on those?
Well, I have heard of them. I've never owned a set of them, but I think they're high quality, and I think they have a very unique look. And I've talked to the owner of that company, and he puts out a very nice product. I haven't tested any of them, and I don't know their thickness or anything about that, but my belief is they would probably be excellent heads.
Next question from Trapper Aaron, and this is from the kind of our discussion here in the shop, showing the ARDUN heads and how they go together. I really enjoyed that video. That was a lot of fun. He says he's wondering if closing that hole more, and I wish I knew exactly. He says about 24 minutes in would make a good spot to put a valve guide. I assume you have to have the drain holes to drain oil from the rest of the head. Have you given any thought to valve guides on that ARDUN head?
Of course, the ARDUN heads do have valve guides in them because the valves are in the head.
Okay.
So
the head serves as the guide.
Yeah, they're actually pressed-in valve guides for all 16.
Okay.
So I don't think there would be a need to have valve guides in the block.
Okay.
That's where the push rod, where the flathead valve guides were. That's where the push rods come up through, and they don't. I don't know if he was implying that maybe you could guide the push rod. I don't know, but that wouldn't be necessary or practical because the push rod, as it comes up and the rocker arms there, the push rod moves back and
I forgot about that.
forth, so it's not a straight line.
Right. So they actually tilt as they move.
Yes. So if that was the question, I don't think that would be a good place to put anything really.
Next ARDUN head question, Steve.
Yep.
Can you tell us what was the timing set at? 26
degrees is where it was set for the single 4-barrel naturally aspirated test, and it was locked in at 26. And what that means is there's no vacuum or mechanical or dynamic, some people call it, advance in the distributor. It's set at 26 degrees, and that's what it is when you start it, and that's what it is, at 6,000 RPM.
It doesn't
26 degrees.
Yeah.
And that was what Don Ferguson had recommended, and I typically follow his recommendations. Now, when we did the supercharge test, the rule of thumb there is that you reduce the advance 1 degree per pound of boost. And so we were expecting about 6 pounds of boost. So instead of 26, we set it at close to 20.
Okay.
Ran the test, and we weren't happy with the results.
Right.
The trained ears in the room, which I'm not one of them, said it sounded lazy. That was the word that was used. And we did go to 112 octane race fuel, not for better performance, but for detonation safety for the engine. And I know there's a bunch of different opinions about this, but general opinion in that room that day was that race fuel burns slower and you need more advance.
Okay.
So we put the timing back to 26 degrees and picked up about 20 horsepower from doing that. So 26 is what it liked.
Yeah, 26.
Yeah.
Excellent. That's good. All right, next question. Do you know what it cost back in the day? We won't put you on the spot what an ARDUN conversion costs today. Maybe someone can figure that out. But back in the day, what was that ARDUN head conversion? Do you know?
I don't know off the top of my head.
That's all right.
But I do know.
Well, maybe we'll save that one for another day.
Or maybe when we get done, let me look, because a lot of times I take screenshots of stuff I see online, and sometimes I send them to you.
Okay, yeah.
But I may have that on my phone.
All right. So Bill's asking, on a V8 engine, and obviously a Flathead is one of those, have you ever noticed a difference in coolant temperatures from one bank to the other? Is it especially with a Flathead, a lot of people don't know this, there's two completely isolated cooling circuits. You've got two water pumps, two jackets, and they don't touch each other, do they?
Only in the radiator, but yeah, besides the radiator, there's no communication of liquid from the left or the right bank.
Right.
My answer is I've never checked that.
Okay.
On a Flathead, it's not too hard to check it because you got two places you can put a sensor, and some of them had two sensors and they just averaged them electrically together.
Oh, is that right?
And got one measurement. But on a lot of cars, the thermostat or the coolant sensors in the intake manifold, or sometimes it's in one of the heads or the other. But I don't typically see two different measurements. But to your point, there's enough mixing, in a typical engine that I'm not sure you'd see much of a difference. But I don't think it's that unusual to see some difference in a Flathead. Yeah. Just because it's like two separate engines.
Like one water pump could be a little more efficient, or I don't even know how the water jackets run in those things either.
I'm sure they'll be close, but I wouldn't be surprised to see a little bit of a difference from one bank to the other.
Yeah. On the Arden heads, what was the compression ratio of that engine?
It ended up being 9.9 to 1. And I did, we mentioned that I flow tested the heads, but I also CC'd the heads, where you take a cylinder head and fill it with, it could be alcohol or water or whatever, liquid in a pyrette, to measure the CCs, and did all, the head gasket thickness and everything else, and it came out to 9.9 to 1.
Jay is asking, is it true that in a Flathead Ford block, the crankshaft is not actually perfectly centered between the two banks? Is that true?
I think he's right. I don't know that I know enough to talk about it today.
Okay.
But there's a lot of things that are, and I think the crank being offset is an example of that. I just don't remember the details.
Yeah. Okay.
But I think he's right about that.
So the follow-up on that, would 4 pistons, would that change the CCs of the combustion chamber, the useful space in there?
Well, I follow the logic. I think the answer is no, because all of the other differences in the block end up making that work out. I think you and I talked about, one bank of cylinders is actually lower than the other. And in the end, the pistons come up to the top dead center the same on all 8. But how that all happens and what the difference is, I just don't remember. At one point, I think I did know the answer to all those questions, but I don't remember many.
It's just occurring to me that maybe the offset crank is made up for by the different decking height of the block.
Well,
maybe that's what's going on.
I just don't. You could be right.
I don't know.
And I think he's right. He or she, I don't know. But yeah, there's a lot of differences from one side of that engine to the other. And I maybe should know all those details, but I don't remember them all.
Well,
but I think he's right. I don't think it's a dead center.
That's pretty fun. There's a lot of things about the Ford Flathead that it's amazing how many things are even a little bit of a mystery still, or there's so many differences.
They are forgotten. I mean, when you see things like that, you just wonder why. Why would they? Why would they have done that? And unfortunately, I think a lot of those questions can't be answered anymore. And I don't think they were written down. But if there are viewers of your channel that know some of these details about, especially the why, I would sure like to hear from them.
All right, very good. So that is a great invitation. We're wrapping up here now, but Steve's exactly right. Please put your comments in here. If you think you have more information that we didn't have, that's great. Also, we like all the questions. If you have other questions about the superchargers, the Arden head, the combination of those, old Flatheads, you showed me more 21 stud blocks this morning than I'd ever seen in one place before. So it's a lot of fun. So thank you for joining us. Thank you, Steve, for taking the time.
Yeah, you're welcome anytime, Barry. See you next time.
We'll see you on the next one. And we got some things brewing. So
yeah, that block right to the side is going to be on the dyno probably in 30 days. So
okay,
I look forward to that.
I'm just noticing the relief cut in there. That's good. All right. So thanks again for joining us, and we'll see you on the next one.